policy. And in this particular session, we'll be looking at how researchers engage with policymakers, but we're looking at that not from the perspective of academic researchers, but from the perspective of people who use evidence in different kinds of policy processes. And we've tried to do that at the global level, at the European level, and at the national level. So we will have a very simple format. We'll have a panel session with 4 panelists, and each panelist will have some minutes to talk about their experience, perhaps about the ways in which they use evidence or research findings or data in different kinds of policy processes, their experiences of doing that, maybe their frustrations with academics. And then we will have a question and answer and a discussion session after that. So the first hour will be the panel session, 10 or 15 minutes per panelist, and then the second part will be the discussion. So we have real-time captions, which you can access through the Zoom caption function or through the links that Cormac has provided if you want to do those externally in a web browser or as a superimposed window. We have 2 ISL interpreters who will take it in turns. Thank you, guys. So what we will do with the panel session is that in between each speaker, I will just impose a very short break, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, just to catch up on the captioning and the ISL, and maybe to change interpreters if they want to do that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is to introduce my colleague, Professor Elena Flynn from the National University of Ireland in Galway, just to say a few words about the DARE project and the context in which this training takes place.
Great, thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. So as Mark said, my name is Eleanor, and I'm the scientific coordinator of the DARE network. And DARE stands for Disability Advocacy Research in Europe. And as Mark mentioned, it's a Marie Curie project in which we have 14 PhD researchers, also known as early stage researchers, who are researching different aspects of disability rights in 7 different partner organizations all around Europe. And as part of their work, they also spend time at civil society organizations on secondment, where they will put the skills and research knowledge they have into practice. And some of the researchers are also based full-time at civil society organizations. So the purpose of DARE really is to train the next generation of researchers on disability rights. And the researchers in DARE are working on a wide range of disability rights subjects and of interest to different countries and contexts around the globe, not just Europe. But of course, our focus is Europe for the purpose of the Marie Curie project. And we are organized with the researchers into 3 main clusters for the research project. And those clusters are voice, power, and change. And I think that gives us a really good basis for today's discussion. So we're interested in how the voices of disabled people can be used to influence change, and the power that different actors have, whether they are civil society organizations, whether they're national human rights institutions, whether they are policymakers or other kinds of stakeholders, and indeed disabled people's organizations themselves. So those all relate to today's discussions, and we'll be hearing more from our panelists about, as Mark mentioned, how they've used the kind of research data and evidence, which also includes the direct experiences of disabled people, in driving change in the different arenas in which they're working, the global, the local, the regional, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and I will hand over to our panelists now to begin.
Thanks, Eleanor. So we have 4 panelists today. It's a really great pleasure to introduce them. We're going to start with Catalina De Vandes, who is now the ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. But I think we all know Catalina better as an activist in the disability movement, and who has held the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities for the last 6 years. So I'll pass directly over to Catalina.
Well, good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this important reflection, a reflection that I believe is absolutely needed, and one that we have been having for a while now. I'm remembering that when I started my mandate, we had a conversation at the point. I remember there was the 7-Up. Theresia, you will perhaps remind me of the name, but for long we've tried to gather together the academia, the researchers, with the work that has been undertaken in the human rights field, because it's needed. Because of course we need to move away from only the part of awareness raising and advocacy as a matter of principle, to start influencing the discussion on how do we actually make the transformative change, how do we make and translate these great principles as standards that we have achieved in the human rights discussions to actual change in the lives of persons with disabilities. And that means how do we influence policy and practice at all levels, right? And so I'm very thankful that we are having this conversation to Leeds, to Galway, to their project, for engaging with us. As Marc said, this is, I'm talking now in a new capacity, not, and this is a moment that for me it's interesting, because I'm also in an internal process of debriefing about the mandate and what we achieved in the mandate, and what were the things that we could have done better in the mandate. Also thinking about lessons learned, about how this mandate needs to be used, how we can use the international mechanisms on human rights to advance the implementation of the rights of persons with disabilities, and how to make it more effective. I think that all of us in the audience here share a common goal of making sure that we promote and make the change that is needed to enhance the conditions of life of persons with disabilities, to make sure that we all enjoy our rights on an equal basis with others. And so how do we interact, and why is that it is so important to have this conversation with the academic world? Because in everything we are doing now, when it comes to have important human rights discussions, what we are seeing, and it has always been the claim, we don't have data, first of all, right? We don't have data. But I think that is no longer, it's not only not longer the case, we are seeing more data coming, but the problem is that we have data only in certain areas, we have only quantitative data, we don't have the analysis of the data, we don't have qualitative data or analysis, not enough, which I think is lacking. And one thing that is key, that is linked to the qualitative part, is that we really need to gather a evidence-based body of potential good practices and solutions on how to move forward. Every time we talk about any issue, you name, for instance, legal capacity, or you name on Article 14 and Article 17 of the Convention, how do we move forward to prohibit coercion on the basis of disabilities? We are faced with the question of policymakers, okay, all good, how do we do it? How do we do it in the difficult cases? What does it entail? What kind of measures do we need to have in place to avoid the use of coercion, for instance, right? And so we are now in the position, and the disability community has this big challenge of not only raising the issue, not only identifying and highlighting these are ways in which discrimination is operating against persons with disabilities, but we are also responsible of making the link with the potential solutions and how do we need to change and transform the policies. And for that, we need to have evidence. It's not longer the case in which we easily could just say, well, look, you have to change it because, of course, you are discriminating persons with disabilities. That took us as well a lot of work on making research and building the evidence. But now we are a stage further in which we need to also say, and this is how we think we need to solve it. And Eleanor said something very important, and how do we do that in a way that also engage the community of persons with disabilities in a way that is emancipatory, that it's participatory, and that we work together with the disability community, their human rights experts, their research, and the policymakers at national level. I think that is a very complex challenge that we have. We really need to have the evidence base, but that evidence base cannot be built without persons with disabilities in the community. We really need to make sure that we have that participation so that we can really identify and connect with the community and their challenges and the potential solutions that will come from them. We need to have also, and perhaps referring to the pros and cons that it has, or Marc, you were telling us about what are the challenges that we had in interacting with the academy. From my mandate, I had a very positive relationship with the different actors doing research on disability. And actually, I think that that relationship helped us to not only deliver better products, but also to transfer that knowledge of the research centers and the different stakeholders that are increasingly doing research with actual implementation, right? I think that the benefit of the human rights system is that we serve as an interface and we connect this knowledge development part that the academy is doing with the needs in the ground, and we try to make that channel. We tried, and again, as I said at the beginning, from the human rights perspective, to gather a group of experts that could support our work because it's needed. And I think that, I mean, that's something that is not happening because of the human rights expert demands. It's happening because of a broader global demand. But that perhaps we need to have better links and better connections with what is happening in knowledge development and the discussions on human rights. How do we make those connections stronger so that we can actually inform the work of the human rights expert in a pertinent way, in a timely way. We had good experiences with the National University of Galway in Ireland, of course, also with Leeds, with Australia, with the US, with Latin America, in trying to get that input from the researchers. We saw shortcomings, as I said, on the qualitative part. There is very little people doing qualitative research that will allow us to extrapolate findings that are broadly applicable. We are still looking at very concrete examples and not a broader review that would allow us to implement broadly, with some exceptions. And I think that, for instance, the work that was done towards the process of the International Principles on Access to Justice with the National University of Galway could be mentioned as a good example of a work that was done in a very comprehensive manner, as well as the process on the privation of liberty that led to a very substantive report that was conducted from the mandate. We have challenges in terms of how do we make sure that researchers are pragmatic enough. And sometimes how do we translate those you know, we have different languages sometimes, right? And the translation is difficult. The conversation with the policymakers, it's also not easy. So how do we make sure that we can try to speak in a language that will make sense to the policymakers? Because at the end, the policymaker is asking us, okay, how to do it. I buy your ideas, I get the CRPD, I get the standards of the CRPD. I need that we have problems. If we have the evidence, then we can move forward, but how do we move forward? It's, again, perhaps with what I started is, we might have quantitative data, but if we don't have the qualitative data and the know-how to say, okay, this is the way forward, we are gonna also lose the opportunity to influence the policy making. And why perhaps why is this useful? And I'm thinking, I mean, I'm just aware of how long do I have? I have to stop now, Mark. Just because I'm completely I lost track of time, so let me know if I have to stop. But in any case, my final message, because I know that you have a lot of young researchers here, people that is studying in this process, is that your work is fundamental. We really need to keep moving ahead with the discussions on the disability rights community and in the global discussions on the rights of persons with disabilities. We need to have more evidence-based arguments to design, to reform, and to implement the policies that are currently discriminating against persons with disabilities. There is huge areas of work, and every single area that I can think of, there is a need for research, and there is a need for more evidence and for more policy advice. As long as we start scratching, whether it's accessibility, whether it's social protection, whether it's coercion or legal capacity, there is always going to be a need to have more and more information and more practical solutions. Some areas, of course, we have moved forward better. In some areas, we still need to have more information. You have to make sure that whether we have the direct participation of persons with disabilities as researchers, and that I think it's something that we need to see more and more, and the participation with the organizations of persons with disabilities. We cannot disregard that, and I think that from my experience as a special rapporteur, that is also one of the most challenging parts, because it's easier and it's faster to go without the community and to go without all the complexity of the perspectives of persons with disabilities. And it's a constant reminder that we need to go together and try to bring to the conversation the needs of those that are further behind. I will leave it there. I know that I've been a little bit disorganized. I think perhaps I have too many ideas in my head that I want to share with you, but I hope that the panel and the other presentations and also the discussion after the panel is going to help us to clarify some of these points. Thank you.
Thanks, Catalina. That's really nice just to present the overview and to really to reinforce just how useful, you know, research and data can be in those big processes. But also, I think, to underline the importance of establishing relationships between researchers and policy people who work in policy processes. And that's not always the people who make big decisions about policy, but people who are engaged in those processes. I think your presentation really underlined that idea of, you know, building up those relationships. And also understanding that research is not done only by academics, but also increasingly by non-governmental organizations, by disabled people's organizations. And so there are different research actors who are involved. Okay, so now we're going to move to our second panelist. Again, a great pleasure to introduce Theresia Degener, who is a professor in law in Bochum University in Germany, but for our purposes was also known to us very well as the former chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And again, that committee was involved in receiving information and evidence from civil society organizations, from states, and in discussions, and trying to influence policy processes in various states through dialogue. So welcome, Theresia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marc, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me as a speaker to this exciting conference. I wish we had the opportunity to not only meet virtually, but physically in a room, because we will miss the magic in the room, which is created when people come together. Even more when these are people who are engaged in exciting research, such as the DARE research project, which I am very happy to be involved with. I believe it is one of the most exciting research projects based on the CRPD, which can create evidence-based knowledge that can have a crucial impact for civil society, for legislators, for judges around the world, for politicians. I believe the research output can help to take the implementation of the CRPD a crucial step further. And as the former chair of the CRPD committee and as a member of the CRPD committee for 8 years, and also as one who has been involved in the making of the CRPD, I read a lot of evidence-based statements by governments, by civil society, by researchers. During the CRPD committee time, I read about 70 state party reports and probably twice or 3 times as much alternative and shadow reports. I was involved in 20 individual communications, in 3 inquiry procedures. I helped to make 7 general comments. So what I've learned from that policy process is the recognition that policy processes are extremely complex and rarely linear or logical. Simply presenting information to policymakers and expecting them to act upon research is not likely to happen. Policy processes are complicated, they have various stages, they have, as Catalina has said, sometimes we speak different languages, not only in different cultures, but in different circles, as diplomats, as researchers, as members of disabilities movement. And so all these stages, they have different lengths, and researchers need to be flexible and very communicative in order to have a policy impact. Politics is tough and slowly moving process, sometimes very slowly, and sometimes it can be very quick. And I think social reforms depend on windows of opportunities, happy coincidences, and repetition. Also, I learned that demanding change creates fear. Researchers need to take these fears into account and respond to them. So let me try to address the 4 questions posed to us felonists. How can academic research influence disability policy reforms? I think the one project which had the biggest impact I was involved in is probably the Degener background report to the CRPD, which was published in 2000 so almost 20 years ago. I can't believe how fast the time is moving. And it was a report on human rights and disability and about the current and future potentials of the treaty, the human rights system of the United Nations in the context of disability. It became the background report of the CRPD and helped make the CRPD come into life. But how was that done and why? It was not the first time that there was a report asking for a treaty. There were at least 2 reported incidences where government had asked for a treaty on disability during the decade of disabled people between 1982 and 1993. Both times they failed, and we got the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities, which is a non-binding resolution. It was important. It brought the agenda forward, but it was not a human rights treaty. And the civil society had for at least 30 years demanded a treaty. But what happened and why was the Degener background so helpful, I think? It happened at a window of opportunity, and the window of opportunity was as follows. Mary Robinson was High Commissioner at the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights, and she was the former Irish president, so she had good contacts to Irish government, and the Irish government wanted to bring disability on the human rights agenda, and people like Jared Quinn and me and Arthur O'Reilly and others were asked to help to draft a resolution for the Human Rights Council I think it was in 2000. That resolution everyone expected it to come forward, and that after that resolution we would have probably the Human Rights Council or a subgroup of it entrusted with drafting a treaty. It failed. Why did it fail? Because 2 countries, I think it was Sweden and Denmark, said we do not have evidence that the human rights treaty system is not working for disability. So the resolution failed, and so that was when Jared Quinn and me were commissioned by the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights to do this background study. And what we did, we researched and reviewed, I think, at least 10,000 documents of state party reports and individual communication, general comments, everything. And we looked at the then 6 existing treaties and their implementation in the context of disability. And we could produce evidence-based findings saying that the medical model of disability prevails, that disability is only dealt with in context of rehabilitation, prevention, very rarely with respect to discrimination, and that disability is not really taken into account in the then existing mainstream human rights treaty. The study so produced this evidence-based research, but it did more. And I think that's why it was so helpful. In the part 3 of the study, we had recommendations for all the stakeholders, recommendations to civil society, how to better engage with the human rights system, recommendation to national human rights institutions, how to be catalysts for change in this context of disability and human rights, recommendations for the human rights machinery, how to work better in the context of disability. And then the last and final chapter was a recommendation for adopting a disability treaty in the human rights field. And I think that was the most challenging chapter. It was the most difficult to get published. Everyone was afraid that was going too far, that was going beyond the mandate of the researchers. However, we did it, and I think it was setting the right path. But this report did not, by its own, create the CRPD, of course not. What happened at the same time was the civil society was more than ready to really demand now a human rights treaty in the context of disability. There was a Beijing summit in 2000 of all the disability NGOs, and there were And governments like Mexico were ready to put forward another resolution in the General Assembly of the United Nations. So there were stakeholders. And so the study came at the right time. There was a window of opportunity. Gatekeepers opened the gate for this report. And then I think all who have been involved in this background study, it was not only Quinn and Degener, but we mainly authored it, but all of us were so surprised to see how big that impact was, how often it was cited. And the interesting thing was the recommendations to how to make the United Nations human rights machinery work better in the context of disability was very fastly implemented. If you look back to the reports of the other treaty bodies at that time, if you look back at the Office of High Commission on Human Rights reports of that time, it was amazing how many of the recommendations were implemented. So I think it was an example of that it was a window of opportunity, and it worked well, but the stakeholders, the gatekeepers were ready for that change. What kind of research findings and evidence are most useful to policymakers was the second question we were asked. I think that change depends on feasible recommendations. The CRPD in the first years, 10 years at least, created incredible opportunities to act and to change disability policy. Why? Because so many countries in such a fast time, never before has a human rights treaty been signed and ratified by so many countries in such a short time. And that developed a commitment by all the states, right? They have to report to the committee within 4 years. They have to, and they have to prove, they have to give evidence to the committee, not only to the committee, also to the State Party Conference in New York, how they implemented the CRPD. So there were politicians, a lot of politicians who said, yes, we are ready, just tell us what to do. Yeah, and then we decide how much money we were going to spend on it. And I think that was at least the first 10 years. Now in the second decade, I see the developments a little bit more skeptical. But what I can say from my 8 years on the committee in that decade, in that first decade, that research was incredibly important for both government and civil society. But the research which had most impact was the research which could be used either for state party reports or national action plans or shadow reports, alternative reports. Let me explain what that is. State party reports are the reports which governments have to present to the committee in order to prove that they are doing in good faith implementing the CRPD. And of course, most governments tend to just cite the legislation and said, yes, we have adopted this legislation and that legislation, and we're spending this and that much money on disability. So we're doing good and we're doing everything fine. That is the usual attitude of governments. Some more reflective governments, let's put it that way, say, well, we see some critical issues here and there, and this is how we will, we plan to attend to these problems in the future. And all of that needs to be based on evidence, statistics, a lot of quantitative data is presented to us. And everything looks fine if you look at the state party report. But the civil society, the disability community tells and the National Human Rights Institute tell the committees everything is not fine in our countries. There is huge gaps, discrimination is going on, people are institutionalized and so on. And so all these statements also need to be backed up by evidence, and that's where alternative or shadow reports come into play. And the most these shadow reports or alternative reports responded to what the government said, and and created or produced counter evidence by different way of analyzing the data, the more helpful it was for the committee, because the committee was the one who read all these reports and then engaged in a constructive dialogue. And what also the researchers needed to know in order to be most effective on how this whole reporting cycle functions. First, the state puts forward a report, then the committee asks some list of issues, and then and reads the alternative reports. Then there is a constructive dialogue, and then it ends with a recommendation, the concluding observations by the committee. Well, in these concluding observations, they cannot be long. There needed to be concrete recommendations to the government, and they needed to address the most sincere issues. And so that was also where I think, as a committee member, I found that research was most helpful, which helped us to translate sophisticated scientific knowledge into feasible recommendations, into clear recommendations of what we demand the governments to do. And it needed to be so clear that we could say, within 2 or 4 years, we're going to follow up and we will check on this. The next question, what are the pros and cons of engaging with academic researchers from a policy perspective? Well, I'm not sure if I can answer this from a policy perspective, but as a researcher, I would say academic researchers tend to be less flexible, because we have research projects, we need time to follow a clear project plan, because we are also, as researchers, accountable to the donors who fund the research. We need to produce output in according to a plan we have submitted earlier, a proposal, and politicians do not fit into that plan. They cannot wait until that research projects has, according to the Gantt chart put forward to the funding organization, is ready to come up with the findings. Politicians always have to be flexible, and they have to always respond to new and challenging situations. And then politicians deal with conflicting goals all the time, whereas as the researcher, you have this tendency, okay, let me focus on this, give me time, let me think it logically through, let me produce good research, but that needs time, and not respond to changes all the time. I will give you a quick example. My Disability Studies Research Institute at my university in Bochum is currently evaluating 6 centers for independent living, which a government has created or established as an implementation measure of the CRPD. And the goal was, within 4 years, please provide data, quantitative and qualitative data, which shows that these independent living centers have helped to improve independent living in that region. We have done it in a participatory way and based on disability studies research implications and theories, and we were the plan was to produce something within 4 years. After the first year, legislation changed in Germany. The politician came to us and said, we need your research finding within 1 year. Otherwise, these 6 centers for independent living will have to be taken off funding if we don't have research within the first year. And that was basically, we had 3 months to produce something. So that is something where researchers and politicians just don't work together very well. And it needs to be, in order to be a researcher who wants to have an impact, researchers need to be incredibly flexible without leaving out or producing, leaving out on the principles of producing good and accountable and valuable, credible research. That is really important, difficult. I come to my final questions. Marc, I'm looking at you. Is it okay, or shall I stop now? Go. Okay, what do academic researchers need to know about evidence and policy making? I have said a lot about that already, but let me say two more things. Transfer of scientific knowledge into politics is based on communication, networking, and consultation skills, and that takes time and most often repetition, repetition, repetition. Researchers who want to be agents of change need a long breath and a lot of additional skills. Able to understand politics, identify key players, good storytellers, able to communicate research findings in simple, compelling stories, good networkers and engineers. Finally, I think, and that is the last thing I want to say, these days in the corona pandemic, I learn again something, which is new phenomena, unknown problems, dangers like the corona pandemic. Politicians turn to scientists all the time. All of a sudden, scientists have a great impact on politics. However, deep-rooted cultural and social practices, such as institutionalization, segregated education, are the hardest to change. Here, scientific knowledge is mostly ignored and consistently and repetitively ignored. Here, researchers need to develop patience and perseverance. I think with that, I stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's great, Theresia. And really interesting to hear, I think, your experience of being on both sides of this equation, both as an academic professor and also as the chair of a committee looking to receive evidence. We're having one or two small connection problems with one of our speakers, which I'm trying to resolve. So I think we'll just take a 2-minute break for everyone, just a comfort break before we come to the next two speakers, if that's okay. Okay, we've solved that problem. Good. So our first two speakers were speaking from the United Nations level, you know, what it's like to be on the UN committee receiving evidence from states, what it's like to do inquiries and investigations into what's happening in states. Our second two speakers are more involved in the policy process at the European level and at the national level. So we'll be coming to them in a minute. But again, it's a similar kind of set of questions and concerns. How can we as academic researchers hope to influence policy development and reform? You know, what's it like to receive research findings or data or evidence within policy processes? What's it like to engage with researchers from a policy perspective? So I'll just check that we have our speakers. So we should have, are you there, Elena? Yeah, that's good. And do we also have Marc? Are you there as well, Marc? I can't see Marc.
Sorry, Marc no sign of the other Marc. He did seem to
he
come in on
says
a
he's
phone.
in.
Oh, hang on. He's here. I can see him,
Great.
but I don't know if he's actually.
He might be on the phone. Yeah.
Yeah. I've asked him to unmute, but I don't know that he's seen.
That's great. We're going to Elena Schubert first. It's a real pleasure to invite Elena to be with us today. We have worked together in exchanging evidence for some time. So Elena is Policy Officer at the Disability and Inclusion Unit in the European Commission. And has been involved in that civil service, not only in disability, but before also in other capacities. So she has quite a large experience of using evidence and analysis within policy process. So we have plenty of time. The floor is yours, Elena.
Thank you very much, Marc. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. It was really great to listen to the presentation of Professor Degener and Madame De Vandes. It was really nice and interesting and inspiring for me. I'm going to present you with my perspective on the disability research and use of the evidence and data in the policy making at the EU level. I have been working in the European Commission in the position of policy officer since 2003. I come from Slovakia, and when I joined the European Commission, my role was to prepare the negotiations of enlargement negotiations in my country was acceding to the European Union. And I was working a lot on the Lisbon agenda, which was predecessor of the European semester, which basically monitored the performance of member states in various areas. I was specifically focusing on the social issues. And at that time, I remember we were drafting reports under Lisbon strategy. And I remember that it was very little known about disability back in 2003, 2004. I was trying to find information on the situation of persons with disabilities in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic. I also worked on Denmark, and it was not that much as it is now. So I think this is certainly due to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that Professor Degener has described so good, that it has given the push and real policy demand for disability research. My intervention is going to be basically designed around three areas. I would like to speak first about the legal obligation of the European Union to do the research, to fund the research, and to use it in its policy-making process. It's also, I would then like to describe the importance of disability research from the perspective of me working on the European semester file. So just to be concrete and to show how the research on disability has influenced the European semester prominence and the prominence of disability in this process. And then I would like to give some ideas for future in disability research, which are, I think, relevant from my perspective. So I start with the legal commitments of the Commission to really do the research, to fund the research, and to listen to the researchers. Of course, the European Union is party to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and in this capacity bound by the commitments deriving from the UNCRPD. Article 31 of the UNCRPD is very clear about it commits state parties to collect information, including statistical and research data. In 2015, the European Union has been reviewed by the UNCRPD committee, and there were some conclusions aimed at the data collection. For example, one of the recommendations was that UNCRPD committee concluded that there is general lack of consistent and comparable data on persons with disability in the European Union. And the committee recommended the European Union really to develop a genuine human rights-based indicator system in cooperation with links to the persons with disabilities. apart from the legal commitments put forward by the UNCRPD on us, on the Commission, we have the EU legislation. For example, Article 10 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that commits the European Union to mainstream disability issue into all policies and actions that might have effect on the lives of persons with disabilities. And our internal governance is set up in a way that we are obliged to operate in open and transparent manner under so-called better regulation agenda. So, for example, all decisions that we make in the Commission need to be and must be based on available evidence. So, for example, we need to put forward impact assessments. We have to introduce roadmaps on all coming initiatives. At the moment, currently, we are preparing, for example, the new European Disability Strategy. And for this strategy, we have a roadmap. We have prepared a roadmap that basically entails basic goals and objectives of the new strategy. And every EU citizen has a possibility to express his or her opinion on this roadmap. For the disability strategy, it has been open since 15th October and will be available until 12th of November. So all of you still can express your views on this. So we have in the Commission and in the European Union really this legal obligation, and our internal processes are designed in the way that we cannot go without evidence and research and data and information, because this is basically our commitment towards the EU citizens. We need to be a public administration that has such a legitimacy and is accountable to the EU citizens. So this is very important to uphold our reputation. We need to make evidence-based decisions. I would like to share with you my experience as a policy officer working in the field of the European semester. In 2008, we have experienced major financial crisis. And in response to this crisis, Juncker Commission put in place an ambitious EU 2020 strategy for jobs and growth to make EU competitive and make it sustainable and sustain as a real social market economy. The European semester has become a tool how to coordinate economic and employment policies of member states in the European Union. This has also its legal base. For example, Article 21 and Article 48 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the Union commits the European Union to coordinate economic and employment policies in member states. This European semester tool was a very structured tool with very tight timetable and deadline. It has started with the annual growth survey. It has continued with the joint employment report being published that basically entailed all employment and social priorities that needed to be taken up and implemented in member states. And the next very important stage of the European semester was the preparation of the EU 2020 country reports. And that was the point where we as the Commission absolutely needed the intelligence, evidence and disability research on each and every member state to be able to put this information in the report that have at the end eventually become Commission staff working documents. And those reports have been then given to the member states governments, and they had to react on it. They had to propose suggestions how they want to improve the situation. So we saw that this for us was, like Professor Degener said, a really important window of opportunity to introduce important issues that need to be tackled at a national level. And this was very, very, very important. And I have to say that I could not do my job without the work of the academic network of experts for disability that has been funded by the Commission, I believe, since 2010. Because this academic network of experts was really good because it had its experts across all member states. And all those experts drafted targeted reports on the situation of persons with disabilities in basically three main areas: employment, education, and social protection. In those reports, since 2010 and 2020, this is the end of the EU 2020 strategy, have become real good points of reference for the official across all Commission services. So, for example, last year we had a break, we didn't have those reports, and we have been called by many of our colleagues with demands: where is your report? We need this information. So it has really become an important terms of reference when it came to the situation of persons with disabilities. I was thinking about what the previous speakers said about quantifying evidence and qualitative evidence. Indeed, in the semester, we worked very, very much with data, with quantifying evidence, with numbers, with indicators, because our approach was to find the comparison, to have a comparable data across member states, so we can compare member states' performance. And this, honestly, when I think about it, went very much at the cost of qualitative evidence. So it was very much focused on the indicators such as at risk of poverty or social exclusion, employment rate of persons with disability, learning, early school leavers rate, tertiary education attainment, so very much indicators driven. But we have also used a lot of input from, for example, Academic Network of Experts for Disability on the situation of persons with disabilities living in institutions, because those reports at the end of the day have influence and are influencing the European semester outcomes, are influencing the funding allocations of EU funding in member states. So, for example, in EU 2020, last year's country reports, semester country reports, I think every country report has included a reference to persons with disabilities. And this will play a vital role for the allocations of funds, because these reports are becoming, let's say, will be a departure point for the negotiations with member states when it comes to funds allocations for the programming period 2021-2027. And now we know with this corona crisis, the EU has put in place a real big volume of funds, not only the multi-annual financial framework, but also EU new generation of funds. So this is the biggest budget in the history of the EU. And without the work of the experts, without disability research in those reports that have influenced also the recommendations that were issued to member states, we would not have such a solid basis for the negotiations, for discussions with member states when it comes to the financial allocations in the interest of persons with disabilities. So this is just to show you how research can influence and has influenced a very important discussion when it comes really to provision of funding. So this is one example. I would like to say that another example is, for example, we have, excuse me? Another example is, for example, that thanks to our cooperation with the researchers and with the scientists in the disability field, we have also received very good analysis on the assessment of disability assessment procedures. And the Commission has also allocated funds for the reforms in member states on the disability assessment reforms and social protection systems. And those findings by researchers are very well used, for example, by our colleagues in DG Reform. And they will also provide very good basis for the future allocations, for example, under resilience and recovery facility that is now being put in place as a consequence of the crisis. For the future, I think from my perspective, because I'm also dealing with the topic of independent living and deinstitutionalization, and we are now drafting a new European disability strategy. And I've noticed that now when I think about the future actions, it would be so good to have data on the number of persons with disabilities in institutions in every member state. As I said, we are very much, the quantified data play very big role in the Commission. And we need to have very good overview of the situation in every member state. So it would be really useful for me to have the data on number of persons with disabilities living in institutions that will be disaggregated by age, by gender, by region. But this we don't have. So it's very, very difficult for me, for example, now to for us to set certain targets without knowing the baseline situation. So this must be improved. We have to work, and we have to continue our work for future in this field. And also, in link with what Ms. De Vandes said, is that we also need qualitative information on the situation of persons with disabilities in these institutions. How do they live? To make sure that smaller institutions or that big institutions are not going to be replaced by small institutions, but to make sure that we really ensure independent life of persons with disabilities. And we can't do that without this evidence, without more information, and also without perhaps some ways how to do it. So we know what we need to do, we know what our goal is, but we would need to have a more practical guidance, perhaps from the researchers, from the experts, on how to get there. So we can then guide member states in this right direction. I can imagine that it must be also very often a challenge for researchers to work with the Commission, because as Professor Degener said, we have our policy priorities. I remember when Juncker Commission prepared the European Pillar of Social Rights Agenda, and we very quickly had to react to that, and we were talking with our experts from academic network how to address the issue of disability under the Pillar of Social Rights, and we had a lot of exciting and inspiring discussion. But as I have to agree with Madame Degener that we had to be very quick, and perhaps researchers could become frustrated that they didn't have more time to dedicate. So when you work with the Commission as a researcher, we really need to be flexible, we need timely input, and you need to have this flexibility to react quickly on to fit into our policy demand. Yeah, I would say this is all from my side in terms of experience of a policy officer dealing with research, with disability research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elena. That's it's really interesting to have the kind of inside perspective of working in the civil service and being engaged in that policy process with colleagues, and as you say, with priorities, policy priorities, political priorities, deadlines, which are very different to the environment in which many academics are working in universities, particularly in relation to timescales. So that's great. We're going to move to our fourth speaker, and we have a connection on the phone. And if we can make this work, then Marc is going to speak from the phone. And then I think I'm going to try to share my screen, if that works, Cormac, with Marc's slide, which will just underline what he's saying. Is that feasible?
Fire away there, Mark. Let's see what.
I'll give it a go.
I can share from here if it's a problem. I have them here too. There we go. Now let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mark.
Oh, fantastic.
Can I just ask? I'm sorry, Mark. Before you start coming in, can everybody see the interpreter as well? I guess nobody's saying they can't. So, Mark, please far ahead.
So I go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. It's been a bit of an ordeal to connect, but we got there in the end. So, my perspective, my name is Marc Verlot. I am a Belgian citizen working for the UK government. And my perspective is a national one. So, what I want to walk you through is one of these weird and strange inconsistencies which have created a window of opportunity in the UK for creating a much more informed and comprehensive disability policy framework. So let me walk you through this. My perspective, which is the first slide, is that the UK at some point a couple of years ago stated as its ambition to develop a overarching disability strategy. The genesis of that is unknown to me. At some point it appeared, and it was very much a bit of a declaration, somewhere quietly during the development of the whole Brexit process under the former Prime Minister Theresa May. Now that was launched in June 19, and as you all know, there have been several political events which have led to other government which is now led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But for some reason, there has been continuity in the Prime Minister's immediate environment, and those principles which were then brought in by Theresa May have been built into the election manifesto of the Conservative government, upon which they were elected with a broad majority. So since then, we not only have a declaration from a government, but also a policy an election promise from this government, which was that they would develop an overall comprehensive disability strategy with two key tenets. First of all, they would put the lived experience of disabled people central. And secondly, there would also have a strong evidence focus. Now, these are quite important, and I think in particular the focus on the lived experience I will unpack a little bit further, because it does actually put a number of questions behind the natures and behind the sort of relevance of the sorts of research that are required for the sort of strategy. But before I go into this, I'd like to sort of quickly run you through the institutional context. And that's important, as you've already heard. So the disability units, of which I am leading the evidence, is part of a construction which is called the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office in the UK is a ministry which cuts across all the big departments like the Home Office, Foreign Affairs, Justice, and others, and actually support the Prime Minister directly to have an overall cross-governmental view. Another aspect of the UK landscape is that we have a number of very strong established charities in the third sector, which can be disability specific or can be pan-disability, and they are quite well organized and use a number of private sector principles in terms of funding, in terms of resourcing and others. At the same time, the development of the disability people's organizations themselves has been very not as strong as such, although there might be some movement on that. The key point I wanted to make in terms of evidence, which really brings us immediately to the heart of the conversation I wanted to have today, is that the UK actually has quite a lot of data on disability. However, those data are not fit for purpose when you want to have a more comprehensive strategy. So when we look at the different big departments, we see that the Department for Education, for example, has quite extensive data on what they call people with special educational needs. And they go down to quite a granular detail. And so has the Department for Work and Pensions on people who have been assessed in terms of benefits, in terms of work. So has the Department for Transport, which has a lot of data on people with access issues and others. However, none of these data speak to one another. So we can't connect the data between education, between DWP, or transport, or housing, or health. And so there is no pan-governmental overview where we understand what happens with disabled people from cradle to grave, and how the different provisions that have been set up in particular sectors like education and housing speak to one another. And that's one problem, but in a lot of ways that's actually an easy problem to fix. You wouldn't think so, but it's actually pretty easy to fix. The main problem I see when we want to look at disabled people themselves is that most of these data are quite descriptive. They talk about disabled people. They never, hardly ever, take into perspective how disabled people experience daily life or how they experience the services which are provided to them. So they do not reflect the lived experience of disabled people themselves. They actually reflect the angle of the organizations which are providing services to disabled people. And that is a key problem. It's a hermeneutical problem because, as we know, the term disability is so almost broad that it doesn't tell us very much at all. So I am on the autistic spectrum. In the right circumstances, I can function really well, and I'm quite high functioning. Put me in the wrong context, with the wrong employer, I crumble. I get lost in train stations unless the signposting is right, and then I can take the train like nobody else. I work with people who use a wheelchair. Now their needs are entirely different than mine. So it is very difficult unless you take those perspectives in terms of impairments into account and how you actually navigate these to provide any services which are meaningful. And that's the key problem with most of the data. The data today are at best descriptive and comparative, but tell us very little about how effective these services are. And that's what our ambition is in the UK today. We really want to design a comprehensive strategy which starts from the person, their experiences, their solutions, and how we can structure services to help them make independent choices and to live life fully. So that's the first slide. Sorry, somebody come in. Shall I go to the second slide?
Yeah, that's good, Mark.
Yeah. So I think that is quite an ambitious perspective. So if that's our perspective, what do I need academic researchers to know so I am able to work with them? First of all, they need to have a good understanding how the institutions work, how the different institutions have different roles, and how decision-making processes work. Now, as Marc previously already said, there's a big difference between a policy environment and an academic environment. And there's a difference between a policy environment and a political environment. And in particular in the UK, the political environment and the policy environment are quite separated. Now, I come from Belgium, where I have had a number of governmental jobs before, and that is quite different there. Political environments and policy environments are much more intertwined, and that gives quite a different, but in some cases that's an advantage when things go well, but often when it comes to the efficiency of the state apparatus, political and policy intertwining can be quite a strain on good working and efficient institutions. So that's something any UK researchers will need to understand, is how these different institutions work, what the relationships is between ministries, how the different responsibilities work, and how these are defined. It's a bit knowing the players in the field, to call it in terms of Bourdieu. And of course, state institutions aren't monolithical anymore these days. The UK, like a lot of other countries, has now a devolved landscape. Different countries in the Union, with Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, sometimes having quite different processes, but also different data. And that moves. So on top of that, we need to understand that most governments today, and the UK government is one of them, is increasingly working with its own evidence landscape. That means that it has a number of institutions it works with, or persons, which provide them with data. For example, we have the Office of National Statistics, which has a pretty strong autonomy, and it has the UK Statistics Authority. It has also the Government Science Office. It has a number of what works centra that summarize research and evaluate it to see what application value research has. It has academic partners and strong third organizations. The issues for me, having been an academic in policy, is that most academics have quite unnuanced ideas about the role of academia towards policy, and actually really understanding how academia sits within that landscape of evidence is quite important. For example, any data person in government will make a difference between official data and non-official data. Official data are data which are produced by a number of official organizations, like the Office of National Statistics, whereas data from academia will be considered very much at the same level as unofficial data, like the third sector. They might be much more robust, but the nature of that data for the government is quite similar to that of any other organization outside. Finally, my third point, I think in understanding what is of value is that really trying to understand where you want to see yourself influencing change. It really depends on what you want to achieve yourself as a researcher. I mean, we've had a whole number of interventions which require descriptive data. As I said, I am particularly looking at data which try to understand the perspective of lived experience to generate change. So in some cases, governments or official institutions will look for findings, descriptive data. There might be after technical expertise. I'm in particular interested in insights, also tapping into some networks and so on. So there is a range of possibilities. It's not one option. Which brings me to the next slide, what I think is most useful. As I said for myself, in the context where we are in the UK, I am less interested in specific findings of a particular piece of research, but much more in the overall picture and understanding where we are and what the evidence tells us, and in particular also what we do not know, what has not been addressed, and why has it not been addressed. Often that's because the data are created in a certain way and therefore other things are being left out. Now, I think it's as important to understand really what the limitations of the data are, what the black holes are in our understanding, as what we do know. And secondly, as I said, in the pursuit of developing a strategy around the lived experience, I think for where I sit, I'm looking for insights rather than particular findings or data and advice. I'm interested in helping to frame policy questions in relation to a broader body of research, rather than having these questions sort of framed for me. It's more of a dialogue. And I'm interested in technical expertise to help developing indicators for dashboard indicators to assess impact over time. All of these things are there in academia to some extent, and are things I would like to develop, and that needs to be developed with people with expertise as we go along. But it also assumes a certain relation of trust and of collaboration. This brings me to slide 5. What are the pros and cons from a policy perspective? So the contrast for working with academia is that it's quite a disjointed sectors. Having worked in it myself, it's some institutions are strong internally, some are a bit of a mess, some are organized well in terms of networks around a particular topic across nationally, but you just never know. And navigating academia for policy people is as much a nightmare as navigating policy networks for academic people. And I think academics tend to sort of sometimes forget that it's not an easy landscape. It's not an even landscape, not a logical landscape, and often it's not a very well organized landscape. And of course, there is always the issue of conflicting professional ethics. And that is something, it's not a major problem. It's just a question of clarity and of trust, I think, in terms of people and in terms of expectations. Advantages are huge, particularly when you're interested in an evidence-based approach, which most governments are increasingly. Working with academics is informative. It provides a more robust basis or critical reflection, and I think both are needed. And also it focuses on particular aspects which are more important. Which brings me to my final slide. How can academics influence policy? I think it's important for any academic to try to find a place and a role in that landscape. And that will change over time. If you want to start defining yourself as an advocate in the beginning of your career, which often is the case because people then associate with the topic or with a particular stance, you can also move to become an influencer, and or the other way around. But I do think it's important to accept that you will have a particular role you find yourself, and that role will be evolving as the world evolves with you. I think as an academic, I always appreciate people being very clear and critical, at the same time trying to be supportive. That's not an easy tightrope, but it is possible. And I think in lots of ways, it's about working with people in governmental institutions rather than with institutions and then people. So as I said, focus on the people in the institutions, not the institutions themselves. But do also know that institutions put limits upon people. Be transparent, and finally, be flexible and responsive. As Marc said, timelines are very different in policy contexts and can be very short, and sometimes you have to really do things in a very short space of time. I think get compressed. The big advantage is it gets things done. That's me. with my perspective. I'm happy to take any questions at any point in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. It's fantastic to have that insight from inside, you know, the central part of government in a large state. And I can say from personal experience that working with the EU Commission, who have tight timelines, working with Mark in the Cabinet Office, much tighter timelines. Sometimes we will have a conversation and you know, you might be saying, well, let's pull together, you know, all the evidence about this into paint a picture. Well, when shall we do that? Well, there might be a cabinet meeting next Thursday, you know. So sometimes that thing about being flexible, but I thought also what you said, Mark, about being flexible, but also being critical and forming relationships. That seems to be a thread that other speakers picked up as well. I think often academic researchers approach people who are working in government in a way where they're trying to sell the findings of a particular research study that they've just done. When in actual fact, what policymakers are often really interested in is having that much broader kind of critical reflection about the evidence base and about the right policy questions to ask. I thought that was really, really interesting. Great. So what we'll do as we approach the last half hour of our webinar is we'll just take a break for 30 seconds or a minute just to allow the captions and the interpreters to have a breath. And when we come back, we're going to select questions from the audience. So I'll be working with Eleanor, who's going to help in selecting the questions, and we will put them to the panelists. So if the 4 panelists could be available, we'll be back in about a minute. And we will be continuing our own training within the network and with our trainees in a closed session later today and talking about their ideas. But thank you to everyone who participated in this open session. It's been fascinating. And we'll communicate about how we can perhaps feed many of these other questions and comments that are coming through, you know, into our deliberations. But I think if there's no more contributions, Eleanor, I don't know if you want to say anything, but we should conclude.
Yeah, I'm fine to just wrap up, Mark, if you want.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you to everyone. Thank you particularly to Cormac for setting up this meeting. Thank you to Vim for the captions and to our 2 interpreters for keeping up with rapid changes of speakers and telephone lines and things. Thank you.